Hi, my name is Alex Burns, my pronouns are he and him, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'll be presenting our paper, From Invisible to Visible, Impacts of Metadata in Communicative Data Visualization. Let's start by looking at a visualization. So I want you to look at this visualization and think, what can you see? Here's a couple of answers. There's lots of correct answers. One thing you might see looking at this visualization is that cases are going down. You may also read the title, which is Top 5 Counties with the Greatest Number of Confirmed COVID-19 Cases, and think this is a visualization about COVID-19. You may also notice structural things about this visualization, such as there isn't a y-axis label. Now we can also ask ourselves, what is invisible here? What's the information that's sort of pertinent to this visualization, but isn't here, or can't see alone? So here are some examples of that. For example, we don't know who collected this data or when. We don't know how the top counties were picked. There's some methods information here that's missing. If we've never seen a visualization like this before, we might not actually know how to read it. There may be also problems with this visualization that we would hope we point out. This visualization is infamous because the x-axis is not in chronological order. So we can't actually conclude what's happening with these cases over time if that's the question we're trying to answer. We don't know who made this visualization. And we also don't know who they made it for, which could help us understand things like design choices. For example, we have counties, but they don't have a state after them, but that may be obvious to Georgia residents for whom this was intended. So in this paper and in past work, we call this invisible information metadata, and we divided it into 6 categories. So the first is the data source. So where did the data come from? There's cleaning and processing, which is what happens to the data after it was collected on its way to becoming a visualization. The next is about explanations of the visual encoding. So how do you read this visualization? There are problems with visual encoding. So are there things we'd like to point out that may be misleading or confusing about this visualization? Who made this visualization? That's metadata about the creator. And who did they make it for? That's metadata about the intended audience. So past work has theorized that there may be benefits to making metadata visible. So for example, cleaning and processing information, so telling people about how the data were processed, may make that visualization seem more credible because it seems more transparent. So in this work, we explored 2 questions about metadata. The first one is, what metadata do people want to see? And the second is, what impact do having that metadata have on their experience and understanding? So first, we explored what metadata do people want to see. So for this experiment, we gave participants a visualization. Our visualizations were drawn from award-winning data journalism projects. There were 32 of these visualizations total in 5 different topics. We also gave them 18 examples of metadata. So that's the 6 categories that we just talked about with 3 concrete examples. So those, for example, a category might be information about the creator, and a specific example of that may be the creator's name or who they work for. We also gave participants a prompt that had a goal, which had a reason for needing that information. So for example, a prompt is, from the list below, select the type of information that you would most like to have to determine if this chart is trustworthy. So the phrase "to determine if this chart is trustworthy" we're calling a goal. So our results indicated that participants selected different kinds of metadata depending on the goal, but not the topic or the chart. So for example, participants, when given the goal to determine if the chart is trustworthy, really wanted information about the source of the data itself. Where, if they were given the goal to make you feel more confident that you understand the chart well, we found that they overall wanted information about the encoding or how to read that visualization. In our second experiment, we explored what happens when you actually give people that metadata. What impact does metadata have on experience and understanding? So for this experiment, we used a different set of stimuli. There are 4 visualizations. Every participant saw all 4 of these visualizations. They're all on the same topic, and they're drawn from a project called Land Grab Universities, which is about land grant universities in the United States. So the procedure worked like this. Participants were shown a visualization. They could spend as long as they like looking at that visualization. When they wanted to continue, we asked them 2 questions to assess their understanding. The first is, what was the main message of this chart? And the second is, what else did you learn? After that, they rated the chart on 7 different scales. 4 of them were related to perceived transparency, and the other 3 were about relevance of that information. Now, the trick here is that half of the participants saw their first visualization without metadata, that is just the visualization alone, or the other half saw that visualization with metadata. And the specific metadata we provided them was about the data source and the encoding explanation, which were overall the types of metadata most requested in the previous experiment. So then they did this again with a second visualization, such that if the first visualization they saw was shown with metadata, the second one was shown without. After participants saw 2 visualizations, one with metadata and one without, we asked them to make a prediction about it. So we gave them a scenario in which an organization wanted to pick a visualization to show to policymakers. And we asked them to predict the probability that each of these 2 visualizations that they had just seen were the one that was selected by the organization. So let's talk about our results. So specifically, when we were assessing understanding, we thought about understanding in 2 different ways. The first one was the correctness of the statements made by participants. So how well was the statement that they made supported by information in the visualization? And the second was the content of their statement. So what were they talking about? In this case, what did they think the main message of the visualization was? And what else did they learn from that visualization? So we found that the presence of metadata did not affect the correctness of the statements made by participants. In fact, participants overall said very correct statements about these visualizations, which may indicate they understood the visualizations quite well. However, we also found that the metadata may have redirected participants' attention to different parts of the chart. So for example, when participants saw this visualization, participants who saw this visualization without metadata often talked about how this chart was about the endowment. However, participants who saw it with metadata instead often specifically talked about Cornell University. So instead, they talked about this maximum. Now, Cornell University is mentioned specifically in the metadata. So this may suggest that the metadata redirected their attention away from just thinking about the title as a way to summarize what this visualization was about, and instead focus on other points of interest in here. Relating to scales and predictions, we found that visualizations with metadata were thought to be more thorough than visualizations without, but just as accurate, clear, and complete. That they were just as relevant to oneself, to others, and just as meaningful. And that visualizations with the metadata were thought to be a little bit more likely to be selected for a presentation with policymakers. So in conclusion, we find that metadata may impact how readers understand and experience visualizations, but we also find that the size of that impact may be relatively small. Our work also suggests that there are many opportunities to explore the impacts of metadata further, including different categories of metadata. So we only explored 2 of the 6. We also presented that metadata always as text in a big block of text, and that alternative methods of presenting that information to people may change the effect that it has on readers of visualizations.